Every year, tens of millions of people walk into the forests of the United States, and very nearly every one of them walks back out. They return to their cars and their campsites and their ordinary lives, muddy and tired, carrying nothing stranger than a phone full of green. But not all of them. Scattered across the great timbered country of the West and the East, across the old growth and the second growth, the laurel hells and the black spruce, the national forests that swallow whole mountain ranges in a single unbroken canopy, a small and stubborn number of people step off a trail on an ordinary afternoon and are never seen alive again. They are not, for the most part, the reckless or the unequipped. They are day hikers and hunters, grandfathers and small children, people who walked a few dozen yards to look at a stream or gather firewood or find a moment alone. And then the trees closed over them. What follows is almost always the same. The search that swells from a handful of rangers to hundreds of volunteers with dogs and helicopters and thermal drones, grinding through country so thick that a searcher can pass within arm's reach of what they are looking for and never know it. And then, more often than the agencies like to say aloud, nothing. No body, no gear, no answer. Only a name added to a quiet list, and a family left to live inside a question that has no bottom. Because the forest does not hide a person the way the desert does, by distance. It hides them by enclosure, by a canopy that eats sound and light and the sky itself, until 100 feet off the trail is as good as 100 miles. This is a countdown of 13 American forests where exactly that has happened. 13 real places, and 13 real people the woods closed over and did not give back. We begin not in some trackless wilderness at the edge of the map, but on one of the busiest footpaths in the American South, because that is the first and most unsettling truth of the deep forest, and it is better to face it at the start than to be ambushed by it later. In the mountains of North Georgia, where the southern end of the Appalachian Trail climbs toward its highest point in the state, there is a peak called Blood Mountain. It rises 4,459 feet above the Chattahoochee National Forest, and the trail to its summit is not lonely. On a fair weekend, it can carry hundreds of people, day hikers and trail runners, through hikers with the whole 2,000 miles still ahead of them, families who drove up from Atlanta for the view. There is a stone shelter on top, built by the Civilian Conservation Corps in the 1930s. There is a famous outfitter down at Neal's Gap, where the trail passes directly through a breezeway in the building. This is not the wild. This is the wild with handrails, and yet the name is older and darker than the crowds. Blood Mountain. The country around it has carried that name for centuries. In stories the Cherokee and the Creek told of a battle so terrible it was said to have stained the ground, and in the ordinary red of the earth itself. The mountain wears rhododendron and mountain laurel so thick on its upper slopes that they form what southern woodsmen call a laurel hell, a tangle of evergreen limbs, waist-high and higher, so dense and so interlocked that a person can push into it a few yards and become, quite suddenly, invisible. The fog comes up off the ridges without much warning, and the terrain that looks so gentle from the parking lot falls away, off the sides of the trail, into steep drainages and cliff bands that the maps do not make you feel. On the 11th of November, 2025, a man named Charles Hosch drove up to hike it. He was 67 years old, an attorney from Dallas who also taught law. And he had come home, in a sense. He had grown up in Gainesville, Georgia, in the foothills below these very mountains, and Blood Mountain was one of his favorite places on earth. He had a small and touching errand that day. He meant to hike to the summit and collect a jar of soil from the top, a keepsake of a place that mattered to him. It was a short outing by any measure, up the Byron Herbert Reese Trail, a connector that climbs from the highway to meet the Appalachian Trail near the summit and back down again. A round trip of only about 5 miles, the kind of hike a fit man of 67 does before lunch. He was not alone on the mountain, and that is part of what makes this so hard to hold. Near the top, he passed the time of day with other hikers. One was adjusting a ham radio. Another was resting in a hammock strung between the trees. Hosch spoke with them, unremarkably, the way strangers do on a popular trail, and mentioned that he was about to start back down. Then he stepped onto the descent, into the green, and walked out of the visible world. When he did not come home, the response was fast, and it was enormous. This was not a case where a family pleaded for weeks to be taken seriously. Within days, the search for Charles Hosch had become one of the largest in the recent history of the Georgia mountains. Across its phases, it drew more than 250 personnel, better than 70 professional search and rescue teams, come from Georgia and Alabama and North Carolina and Tennessee, joined by 50 and more volunteers. There were K-9 units working the scent. There were drones overhead, quartering the canopy with thermal cameras that can pick a warm body out of cold ground. There were helicopters. There were technical rope teams lowering themselves over the cliff bands and into the laurel-choked ravines where a fallen hiker might come to rest. They searched the summit and the shelter and the trail and the country on either side of it. The way you search when you have every reason to believe the person is close, because everything about the case said he should have been close. He had told people he was heading down. He was on a 5-mile trail he knew. The parking lot was right there. They found nothing. Not a jacket, not a trekking pole, not the little jar of soil he had carried up for the summit. In the last week of November, with the mountain giving up not a single clue, Union County scaled back the official search. The county's emergency management director put it about as plainly as it can be put. They had not found a clue. Family and private searchers kept at it after the agencies stood down, walking the ravines through the winter. But the record, as this film is made, is stark and unchanged. Charles Hosch walked down from the summit of a mountain that thousands of people climb every year, on the most heavily traveled long trail in the country, in clear November daylight, minutes after speaking with witnesses, and he was never found. Sit with the shape of that, because it is the shape of everything still to come. We tell ourselves that people vanish in the forest because they went too deep, or too far, or too unprepared. That disappearance is a punishment for recklessness, and that the careful and the near are safe. Blood Mountain says otherwise. It says that the forest does not require a vast distance or a foolish mistake. It requires only a few dozen yards of laurel, a fold of ground the searchers cannot see into, a canopy that turns a shout into nothing, and 100 feet into 100 miles. A man can be near the summit, near the trail, near his car, near other human beings, and still be gone, completely and perhaps forever, in the time it takes to walk downhill and around a bend. That is why we begin here, on the trail with the handrails, and not in the true backcountry, because if the busiest forest in the southeast can quietly keep a careful man in plain sight of the summit, then what follows is not a collection of freak events at the edge of the possible. It is a pattern. It is the ordinary behavior of deep timber, observed 13 times in 13 different American forests over more than half a century. And the cases only grow stranger, and the ground only grows wilder from here. If Blood Mountain, signed, crowded, a few miles from a full parking lot, can do this, then the deeper woods are not the exception. They are the rule. And the next forest is one so dark that the people who named it called it the land of the noonday sun. The Nantahala National Forest in western North Carolina takes its name from a Cherokee word that translates with a kind of somber poetry to the land of the noonday sun. It is a place of profound verticality, where the mountains are crowded so closely together and the gorges are so steep and narrow that the sun only strikes the valley floor for a brief hour or two at the height of the day. For the rest of the time, the forest exists in a state of permanent moss-dampened twilight. The canopy here is not merely a ceiling, it is a shroud of ancient hardwoods, towering hemlocks, and rhododendron thickets, so tangled and impenetrable that they are known to locals as laurel hells. These are not forests you walk through so much as forests you navigate, and in the deep folded terrain of the Blue Ridge Mountains, the geometry of the land is designed to deceive. A ridge that appears to be a clear path forward can drop away into a ravine that leads miles in the wrong direction, and the sound of the wind through the pines can mimic the sound of a human voice or swallow one completely. It was into this labyrinth that Christopher Peter Sexton drove his blue Kia minivan in the second week of March 2018. Christopher was 48 years old, a man from Winston-Salem who lived with a documented cognitive impairment, a condition that necessitated a degree of watchfulness from those around him. When he went missing, the authorities issued a silver alert, a recognition of his vulnerability in a world that requires a precise, linear awareness to navigate. His disappearance triggered a search that was methodical and intense, pulling together resources from across the region to comb the rugged topography around Tellico Gap and the Wesser-Bald section of the Appalachian Trail. The searchers were not novices. They were teams of professionals, men and women who understood the way the Nantahala Gorge holds secrets, and they understood the danger that the mountain posed to a man who might have become disoriented. They searched the trail corridors, the overgrown logging roads, and the high ridges where the wind howls and the visibility drops to near zero during a spring storm. They scanned the steep, treacherous slopes that plunged toward the Nantahala River. They walked the paths until their boots were worn and their eyes were weary, checking the same ground over and over again, yet the forest remained silent. The blue minivan was eventually found abandoned at a trailhead near Tellico Gap, a silent, static sentinel that offered no clues as to the direction Christopher had taken. As the days stretched into weeks and the weeks into months, the search was gradually scaled back, and then, for all practical purposes, it ended. Christopher Sexton became a name on a list, a missing person whose story was frozen in the amber of an open, unresolved file. Then, 4.5 years later, in December 2022, the forest finally surrendered its secret, though not because a searcher had found it. A hunter, moving through the deep, trackless backcountry of the national forest, came upon the remains of a person in a section of the woods that had been scoured during the initial search. There was no grand revelation, no dramatic confrontation with a mystery. There was only the skeletal reality of a human being who had simply walked into the trees and, overcome by the elements or the labyrinthine nature of the terrain, had come to a stop. Dental records confirmed what the family had feared for nearly 5 years. It was Christopher Sexton. Investigators, in their review of the site, found nothing to indicate foul play. There was no evidence of a struggle, no sign of a third party, and no indicator that his death was anything other than a tragic, solitary end brought on by exposure in a place that does not forgive a single wrong turn. But the fact that he was found by a chance passerby, years after the official search had concluded, is a haunting testament to the limits of human effort in such a landscape. It forces a realization that is difficult to process. Hundreds of trained, focused, and determined people had likely walked within a few hundred feet of him, and the forest, with its dense laurel, its folded ravines, and its deceptive, light-starved floor, had kept him hidden. It had taken a man who was lost and simply tucked him into a fold of the earth where the light did not reach, holding him in the quiet dark for years. When we consider the Nantahala, we are forced to confront the idea that the forest does not necessarily move to hide a person. It only has to be itself. It is a vast, indifferent architecture of wood and stone that functions according to its own ancient, silent rules. A person can be right there, in the woods, and yet be as unreachable as if they were on another planet. The Nantahala kept Christopher Sexton for 4.5 years and then gave him back by accident. Farther north, in the high spruce of West Virginia, a young mother would be found the same way, but 8 miles from where anyone thought to look. Spruce Knob rises 4,863 feet into the sky of eastern West Virginia, serving as the highest point in the state. To reach it, one must navigate a world that feels as if it has been carved out of the very atmosphere. The trees here are not the sturdy, sky-reaching giants of the lowlands. They are the wind-bent red spruce, their branches twisted and forced into one-sided silhouettes known as flag trees, forever pointing away from the relentless, biting gales that scour the ridge. It is a place of rock, moss, and constant, shivering chill, sitting within the high, rugged reach of the Monongahela National Forest. Below the summit, the land drops away into the Seneca Creek backcountry, a dense, labyrinthine drainage of hemlock, rhododendron, and jagged limestone that resists navigation even for the experienced. It is a landscape that demands a respect for scale, for the way the air thins, and for how quickly a man-made trail can dissolve into the trackless, silent chaos of the high mountains. On March 11th, 2021, a 24-year-old woman named Cassie Sheetz was seen at the summit of Spruce Knob. She was a mother, a resident of Upper Tract, and she had come to the mountain with 2 male companions. They were there to hike the Huckleberry Trail, a path that traces the ridgeline before descending into the basin below. It was a day that began with the mundane intentions of any afternoon hike, but it ended in a separation that has remained a hollow, unanswerable point of frustration for those who search for the truth of what happens in the woods. According to reports, the 3 hikers became separated while moving through the high-elevation forest. As the afternoon wore on and the mountain light began to fail, the 2 men eventually emerged from the tree line and found their way to safety, arriving separately after midnight. They reported that they had lost sight of Sheetz and had attempted to search for her in the gathering dark. The response from the West Virginia State Police, the United States Forest Service, and local search and rescue teams was immediate and exhaustive. They descended upon the Monongahela with the grim, methodical intensity that characterizes these operations. Teams scrambled through the snow-patched terrain, battling the same windswept, inhospitable conditions that had defined the mountain for centuries. They combed the Huckleberry Trail, the surrounding ridges, and the treacherous, dense thickets of the Seneca Creek drainage. They employed every tool available to them: thermal imaging, ground teams, and local knowledge. But the high-altitude forest proved to be an impenetrable shield. After weeks of backbreaking labor, the primary search efforts were forced to wind down, leaving behind only the silence of the spruce and a family anchored to an agonizing, open-ended question. The case of Cassie Sheetz was not solved by the search teams. It was not solved by a breakthrough in evidence or a sudden epiphany. It was resolved, in the coldest sense of the word, on December 29th, 2021. 9 months after she had walked into the trees, 2 hikers, passing through a remote, untrailed section of the Monongahela National Forest, stumbled upon human remains and a set of keys belonging to her. The recovery site was roughly 8 miles from the trail where she was last seen. In January 2025, DNA analysis officially confirmed the identity. The investigation was eventually closed by state authorities, but the closure brought no narrative clarity. There was no public determination regarding the exact cause of death, and no charges were ever filed. The distance is the detail that refuses to settle. 8 miles is a vast expanse in the rugged vertical folds of the Monongahela. It is not a distance one wanders into by accident on a marked trail. It represents a departure from the known, a journey into a wilderness so tangled that even the most seasoned woodsman would struggle to navigate it in a straight line. To be on a trail with companions and to end up 8 miles away in a remote drainage without a clear path or a recognizable reason is to confront the terrifying capacity of the forest to swallow a person's final hours. It suggests a movement that defies the logic of a simple, disoriented walk. It suggests that the forest is not merely a backdrop for a hiker's misfortune, but an active, indifferent force that, once a person is separated from the group, can claim them, move them, and hide them in a way that makes the efforts of hundreds of searchers look like shadows against the dark. The forest does not explain why, and it does not apologize for the time it takes to reveal its ledger. It only holds what it is given, keeping the secrets of the Seneca Creek Basin behind a wall of spruce and stone. We look at the map, and we see the trail, the ridges, the parking lot, and the geography of a day trip gone wrong. But the forest sees only the enclosure. It sees the way the light fails, and the way the trees close the gaps behind the traveler. There is no comfort in the recovery of remains after so long, only the final chilling confirmation that the woods had been holding her all along, just out of reach, in a place she was never meant to be. 8 miles in the wrong direction, in country she was never meant to enter. The forest moves people somehow and does not explain itself. In the north woods of Michigan, it would take a man and leave only his dog to find its own way home. The eastern Upper Peninsula of Michigan is a landscape of singular, heavy silence. It is a country defined by the slow, dark transit of the Chequamegon River as it winds through cedar swamps and vast, tangled stands of northern hardwood toward the great basin of Lake Superior. This is not the jagged, vertical wilderness of the high mountains, nor the sprawling, sun-drenched expanse of the western plains. It is a flatter, more claustrophobic geography, where the forest floor is often a sponge-like mat of moss, rotting wood, and impenetrable tag alder thickets. To walk here is to accept that you are being watched by the stillness of the bog. It is a place that feels ancient and indifferent, where the scent of pine needles and damp earth hangs heavy, even in the middle of summer. Near the small town of Paradise, the North Country Trail cuts a lonely path through the Lake Superior State Forest, following the river's edge before disappearing into the deep, shaded reaches of the woods. It is a trail that invites a particular kind of solitude, a quiet, meditative walk where the only sound is the rhythmic crunch of boots on leaf litter and the distant, muted rush of the river. On the morning of July 13, 2008, Joseph Robert Clewley, a 73-year-old man from Lansing, sought exactly that kind of solitude. He was a man well acquainted with the North, having spent significant time at a family cabin tucked away in this stretch of the Michigan backcountry. He was not a novice, not a tourist looking for a quick photograph of a waterfall. He understood the woods, and he understood the way the northern light could shift and deceive once the sun began its long descent behind the canopy. That morning, he told his wife he intended to hike a segment of the Taqua Trail. He brought his dog, a companion named Chip, and set out with the intention of returning by evening. He left his van at the trailhead, a mile or two from the cabin, and walked into the trees. When the shadows lengthened and the evening air turned cool, the cabin remained empty. The search that followed was exhaustive, a testament to the dedication of the Michigan backcountry search and rescue teams and the local agencies who understood precisely how quickly a human being can be erased by these woods. They combed 10,000 acres of forest, swamp, and riverbank. They moved in line, shoulder to shoulder, beating the brush until their hands were raw and their eyes burned from the effort of scanning the forest floor. They utilized scent dogs, ground teams, and local volunteers who knew the terrain as well as they knew their own backyards. They moved through areas so thick with cedar and alder that the sun rarely reached the mud beneath, places where visibility was reduced to a few feet in any direction. They checked the river, the ravines, and the high ground. They looked for a scrap of clothing, a footprint, a discarded water bottle, any sign that a 73-year-old man had passed through. They found nothing. The forest yielded no trace of Joseph Clewley. It did not give up a boot, a hat, or a single shred of evidence to suggest what had occurred between the trailhead and the coming of the night. The search teams were left to navigate a vacuum, a space where a man had simply ceased to be, leaving behind only the cold, unyielding reality of the timber. But the most haunting aspect of the disappearance did not emerge until much later. 20 days after he had vanished, nearly 3 weeks of survival in the deep, unforgiving Michigan wilderness, the dog, Chip, wandered back to the cabin. The animal was thin, having weathered the forest's challenges on its own, but it was alive. It had survived the nights, the predators, and the hunger that inevitably claims the unprepared in the northern reaches. The return of the dog brought with it a desperate, agonizing hope, but it provided no answers. Chip could not speak to the path they had taken, nor to the moment their journey diverged. The dog had returned to the place it knew as home, but the man he had been with remained somewhere out in the green, held fast by the forest that had closed behind them. There is a profound, quiet cruelty in this reality. We often imagine that a disappearance in the woods must involve a struggle or a dramatic departure, a moment of acute crisis that leaves a trail of evidence behind. But the case of Joseph Clewley suggests a far more unsettling possibility, that the woods can simply swallow a person whole, without a sound, without a struggle, and without leaving a single fragment of their life for us to find. The forest is not a predator in the way we usually define it. It is a vast, patient entity that simply rearranges its silence to fill the space where a person once stood. A man walks in, a dog walks out, and the woods remain exactly as they were before, unchanged, indifferent, and absolute in their secrets. The searchers looked for 3 weeks, and then for years afterward, but the earth and the timber kept their guest. The dog came home. The man did not. That is the arithmetic of the deep forest, and it does not balance. In the northwoods of Wisconsin, another car would eventually be found with its doors hanging open, the engine cold, and its owner already gone into the trees. In the far north of Wisconsin, where the state begins to lose its sense of Midwestern order and dissolves into the deep, tangled expanse of the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest, the landscape changes. It is a region of vast, rolling timber, 1.5 million acres of northern hardwoods, trembling aspen, and dark, stagnant kettle bogs that seem to swallow the very idea of a horizon. In Sawyer County, near the small, quiet community of Draper, the forest is not merely a place you visit. It is a weight you move through. It is a maze of gravel logging tracks and forest roads that wind for miles through the shadows of spruce, offering a deceptive promise of accessibility. You can drive for an hour here and see nothing but the shifting, repetitive geometry of trunks and ferns, a green-black world where the light is always filtered and the air is always heavy with the damp, slow rot of the forest floor. It is beautiful, but it is a beauty that lacks a center, a place where a person can wander a few hundred yards from a road and find themselves in a wilderness that looks identical in every direction. On the morning of June 20th, 2003, a 23-year-old man named Andrew Robert Bliss drove into this silence. Andrew was a young man from the region, and by all accounts from those who knew him, he had been struggling with a period of profound personal instability. He had recently left his employment, and he was navigating the aftermath of a difficult romantic separation, a time of life when the internal geography can be as fractured and confusing as the woods themselves. He drove his 2001 Chevrolet Impala deep into the forest, following the ribbons of gravel that eventually taper off into the overgrown, narrowing traces of Forest Road 162. There is a point where the road stops being a road and becomes merely a suggestion, a faint indentation in the brush. And it was somewhere in that transition that Andrew Bliss stopped driving. When his vehicle was eventually discovered, it sat as a monument to a sudden, absolute departure. The doors of the Impala were standing wide open to the humid June air. The keys were still resting in the ignition. The gas tank was empty, drained by the miles of aimless driving through the labyrinthine logging roads. And the car sat there, abandoned, as if its driver had simply decided, at that precise coordinate, that he would go no further on wheels. When he failed to return, the search effort that followed was extensive, reflecting the genuine concern of a community that understands what happens when a person vanishes in the Northwoods. The Sawyer County Sheriff's Department initiated a massive sweep of the area, a ground and air operation that began 4 days after he was last seen. They deployed fire association crews to comb the thickets, and they brought in K-9 teams to work the scent through the dense, swampy brush that bordered the road. Overhead, 2 Civil Air Patrol aircraft circled the canopy for hours, their pilots scanning the breaks in the timber for any sign of movement, any flash of color, any disturbance in the green. They found nothing. The woods, in their stubborn, layered density, yielded no trace of the young man who had walked away from his car. There was no pack, no discarded clothing, no footprint that led away from the ignition. The searchers worked through the heat of the Wisconsin summer, pushing through the thickets of cedar and the tangled understory. But the forest did not offer up a single clue to his direction or his fate. As the days stretched into weeks, the search eventually slowed, then stopped, and the official status of the case settled into a hard, unchanging silence. 20 years later, in 2023, the authorities renewed their public appeal, hoping that a 2-decade-old memory might finally surface, that someone might recall a detail about that morning in June that had remained locked away. But the forest, in its vast, indifferent way, had long since integrated the mystery. There is no evidence in the record of foul play, no suggestion of a struggle, and no indication of any encounter with another person. The case of Andrew Bliss remains what it has always been, a stark encounter between a human being in a state of distress and a landscape that is perfectly equipped to erase the presence of a person without effort. It is a terrain-driven vanishing, where the geography itself acts as a barrier to discovery. A person steps out of a car, walks into the green, and in the span of a few minutes, the distance between them and the rest of the world becomes absolute. There is a cold, clinical logic to this kind of disappearance. It does not require a grand conspiracy or a hidden predator. It requires only the physical reality of the Northwoods, where the dense canopy and the sprawling, monotonous terrain can render a human being invisible to a search party within the first hour of a walk. The searchers, despite their dedication, were looking for a needle in a forest of needles, and the forest, in its silence, kept its secret. To walk away from a vehicle with the doors left open is to signal a break with the life one has known, a transition into a space where the rules of civilization no longer apply. An open car door on a dead-end forest road, and 20 years of silence. It is a pattern you will see again and again in this film. The vehicle left behind, the person gone. On the edge of the boundary waters, it would be a restored old pickup and a young man who packed as if he never meant to go far. In the far northeastern corner of Minnesota, where the state's border dissolves into the Ontario wilderness, lies the Superior National Forest, a vast and trackless expanse of boreal jack pine, black spruce, and bog. This is the edge of the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, one of the most remote and inaccessible regions in the lower 48 states. It is a place of rugged beauty, where the lakes are long and narrow, the forests are dense, and the wildlife is plentiful. But it is also a place of quiet danger, where the unwary can easily become lost, and the unprepared can quickly succumb to the harsh conditions. It was here, in the autumn of 2004, that a young man named Nathan Williams came to fish and hunt, seeking the solitude and adventure that the wilderness offers. Williams was 21 years old, a senior at the University of Minnesota-Morris, and an experienced outdoorsman. He had grown up in Maryland, but had fallen in love with the North Country and had spent many summers exploring the woods and waters of Minnesota. This trip was to be a solo adventure, a chance for him to test his skills and push himself to the limit. Williams left for his trip on September 28, 2004, driving his restored 1966 Ford pickup truck, which he had rebuilt with his father. He was headed for the Kawashiwi Lake area, a remote and scenic region of the Superior National Forest, where he planned to spend several days fishing and camping. But when he failed to return on schedule, his family became concerned, and a search was launched. The authorities found his truck, parked near the Kawashiwi Lake Forest Road, but there was no sign of Williams himself. The truck was unlocked, and the keys were still in the ignition, but the only clue was a cryptic note, which read, "Gone to find help." The search for Williams was extensive, involving multiple agencies and covering a wide area. The authorities used dogs, aircraft, and underwater cameras to scour the lakes and forests, but they found nothing. No sign of Williams, no sign of his gear, no sign of anything out of the ordinary. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The search continued for several days, but eventually it was scaled back, and the case was left open, but inactive. The strange thing about Williams' disappearance was that he had left behind almost everything. His truck, his fishing rods, his shotgun, even his clothes and bedding. The only thing that was missing was Williams himself. It was as if he had stepped out of his truck and into the forest, without taking anything with him. The authorities found no sign of struggle, no sign of foul play, just a complete and utter disappearance. The investigation into Williams' disappearance was thorough, but it turned up nothing. The authorities interviewed his friends and family, but no one had any idea what might have happened to him. They searched the area, but found no sign of him. They even used cadaver dogs, but they found no scent. It was as if Williams had never been there at all. The case of Nathan Williams is a mystery, a puzzle that has never been solved. It is a reminder that the wilderness is a powerful and unforgiving place, where the unwary can easily become lost, and the unprepared can quickly succumb to the harsh conditions. It is a place of quiet danger, where the rules of civilization do not apply, and where the strong survive while the weak perish. But the Superior National Forest is not just a place of danger, it is also a place of beauty, a place of wonder. The lakes are long and narrow, the forests are dense, and the wildlife is plentiful. It is a place where the outdoorsman can test his skills and push himself to the limit. It is a place where the nature lover can find solace and inspiration. And it is a place where the curious can find mystery and intrigue. The forest is a place of secrets, a place where the trees whisper to each other and the wind carries the whispers away. It is a place where the sun rises over the trees and sets over the lakes, painting the sky with colors of gold and crimson. It is a place where the stars shine bright and the moon casts a silver glow over the forest floor. And it is here, in this place of beauty and wonder, that Nathan Williams disappeared. He vanished into the forest, leaving behind only his truck and his belongings. He left behind his family and his friends and his life, and he was never seen again. The case of Nathan Williams is a reminder that the wilderness is a powerful and unforgiving place. It is a place where the unwary can easily become lost, and the unprepared can quickly succumb to the harsh conditions. But it is also a place of beauty, a place of wonder. and it is a place where the curious can find mystery and intrigue. 6 miles of forest, and not a single thread. The boreal north keeps its secrets as completely as any place in America, but the western mountains have their own way of taking a man, and one Montana hunter would leave behind the strangest clue of all, his own boots. The crazy mountains rise out of the plains of central Montana, like a jagged, rusted blade thrust through a silk sheet. They are an island range, detached from the main body of the Rockies, standing in stark, vertical isolation between the Yellowstone and Musselshell rivers. To the people who live in the towns of Big Timber and Melville, the Crazies are more than just a geographic feature. They are a formidable wall of granite and old-growth timber, riddled with a checkerboard of public forest and private ranch land that makes the geography as convoluted as it is beautiful. These mountains are not known for being forgiving. The drainages are steep, narrow, and prone to sudden, violent weather systems that can drop from the peaks into the canyons with almost no warning, turning a bright autumn afternoon into a freezing, whiteout nightmare. It was into this unforgiving country that Aaron Joseph Hedges, a 38-year-old from Bozeman, arrived in the first week of September 2014. He was an experienced hunter, a man who understood the rhythm of the mountain and the necessary preparations for a week in the backcountry. He entered the woods at the Cottonwood Lake trailhead, alongside 2 companions, a group intent on spending several days pursuing elk in the high-elevation basins near Campfire and Sunlight Lakes. The mechanics of the hunt required the party to split up. While his companions moved with the assistance of horses, Hedges chose to strike out on foot, carrying his gear and his bow, planning to rendezvous at a pre-designated point after retrieving a supply cache he had staged earlier. It was a standard enough plan for men who knew the terrain, but the Crazies have a way of distorting distance and direction, especially when the light begins to fail or the clouds drop to the tree line. Hedges was last heard from on the 5th of September. He had become disoriented, missing his intended route, and as he attempted to adjust his course, a severe late-season storm began to bear down on the range. His companions, faced with the rapid onset of a dangerous high-altitude blizzard and unable to locate him in the deteriorating conditions, ultimately made the difficult decision to descend to the lower valleys, hoping to find him or alert the authorities. What followed was a search effort, as arduous as the terrain itself. When Hedges did not materialize at the trailhead, the Custer Gallatin National Forest became the site of an intense, month-long operation. Searchers combed the drainages and the high benches, but the mountain was a sprawling, indifferent maze. That autumn, the first of the physical clues began to emerge, not in a way that offered comfort, but in a way that deepened the unease. A search party discovered his boots, abandoned in the dirt, along with a hydration pack and the remains of a small spent fire. The presence of the boots was the most haunting detail. To a hiker, boots are the primary tool of survival. To find them discarded in the wilderness, miles from a road or a cabin, suggested a state of confusion or extremity that is difficult to process. Later that winter, and into the following summer, the mountain slowly surrendered more of his possessions. His bow, his backpack, and his hunting license were recovered in different locations, scattered across the east side of the range. He had been moving, but he had not been moving toward safety. He had been moving in a direction that pulled him further into the deep, trackless timber. For nearly 2 years, the case remained an open wound. The searchers had done their work, the seasons had turned, and the Crazies had gone quiet, as they often do once the snow sets in. It was not until August of 2016 that a local rancher, riding through the rugged, inaccessible country near Melville, chanced upon skeletal remains. Forensic analysis would eventually provide the final cold confirmation that the search had been looking for all along. The remains belonged to Aaron Hedges. The official investigation into his death pointed toward the most common, yet most terrifying, of wilderness killers: hypothermia and exposure. The reality of his final days was a testament to how quickly a capable man can be unraveled by the elements. In his disorientation, he had wandered into the high-altitude trap of the range, suffering the paradoxical effects of extreme cold, which frequently drive victims to shed their clothing and gear before the end. The horror of his disappearance was not one of violence or mystery, but of a slow, lonely dissolution in the dark timber. It took almost 2 years to find what was left of him, and even then, it was not the organized effort of search and rescue that brought him home, but the sheer luck of a rider moving through the brush at the right time. He had left his boots behind and walked on into the timber, and the mountains kept him for 2 years. In Oregon, a man would step aside to take a single photograph a few hundred yards from his friends and be gone before they finished making camp. To understand the peculiar trap of the high Cascades, one must look to the places that appear at first glance to be the most beautiful. In the northern reaches of the Willamette National Forest in Oregon, where the volcanic spine of the state rises into the cold air, sits the Mount Jefferson Wilderness. It is a landscape defined by sharp contrasts: the dark, ancient canopy of the lower valleys, giving way to the stark, sun-bleached rock of Mount Jefferson itself, a stratovolcano that looms over the region like a white tooth. At the northern foot of this great peak lies an alpine basin known as Jefferson Park. It is a place of postcard perfection, a high-altitude terrace of emerald meadows, fields of purple lupine and red paintbrush, and a string of clear, cold lakes reflecting the snowfields above. The Pacific Crest Trail winds directly through this basin, and during the short summer window between the melting of the snow and the return of the autumn storms, it is one of the most popular backpacking destinations in the Pacific Northwest. It is an open, airy country, ringed by subalpine fir and mountain hemlock, a place where the sky feels vast and the margins of the forest seem too thin to hide a secret. Yet, this high country beauty is an illusion of safety. The terrain that looks so clean from a distance is, on the ground, a complex maze of glacial moraines, steep talus slopes, and dense stunted stands of timber known as krumholz. These tree islands, shaped by heavy winter snows, grow in tight, impenetrable clumps, their branches sweeping the earth to create dark, hollow cavities underneath. Between the meadows lie deep ravines carved by meltwater streams, where the brush grows thick and the earth is unstable. It is a landscape where a person can stand on a ridge and see for miles, yet step 10 yards off the path and vanish into a fold of the mountain that cannot be seen from any trail. On the 9th of August, 2012, a 52-year-old Oregon resident named Ronald Allen Ohm set out to experience this high country. He was not a novice. He was an experienced hiker, familiar with the rugged nature of the Cascade Range and well prepared for the environment. He was joined by 2 companions, and together they planned a multi-day backpacking trip into the heart of Jefferson Park. They began their journey at the Breitenbush Lake trailhead, a high-altitude entry point that leads hikers through a series of forested ridges before dropping into the lakeside basins below. Ohm was carrying a full complement of gear: a heavy backpack, a tent, a sleeping bag, several days of food, and 4 days of essential medication for a chronic health condition. He was equipped to survive the elements, and he was walking with friends. The hike began without incident. The group made their way along the trail, climbing toward the ridge that overlooks Russell Lake, the largest of the water bodies in the Jefferson Park Basin. As they reached the high ground, with the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the valley, Ohm decided to pause. The view from the ridge was spectacular, with the massive northern face of Mount Jefferson rising directly behind the blue waters of the lake. He told his companions that he wanted to stay behind on the ridge for a short while to take some photographs of the scenery. He suggested they head down the slope to the lakeside basin, select a campsite, and begin setting up their tents. He would join them shortly, descending the well-defined path once he had captured the light. His friends agreed, left him on the high ground with his camera and his heavy pack, and walked down toward the water. It was a distance of only a few hundred yards. The descent from the ridge to the lakeshore is short and direct, a route traveled by thousands of hikers every season. From the basin below, the ridge remains visible, a sharp line of stone and stunted hemlock against the sky. But Ronald Ohm never walked down that path. When his companions finished setting up the camp and realized that the afternoon was fading into twilight without any sign of their friend, they began to worry. They called out into the cooling mountain air, but their voices were swallowed by the vastness of the basin. They retraced their steps up the trail to the ridge where they had last seen him, but the high ground was empty. There was no sign of Ohm, no dropped piece of gear, and no answer to their shouts. As the darkness settled over Mount Jefferson, bringing the sharp drop in temperature common to the high Cascades, the anxiety turned to a quiet dread. The next morning, with the wilderness still silent, the search began. The response from local authorities was swift and massive, developing into one of the largest and most intensive search and rescue operations in the modern history of the Oregon wilderness. The Marion County Sheriff's Office took the lead, but the scale of the effort quickly drew in resources from 5 neighboring counties, as well as the specialized mountaineers of Portland Mountain Rescue. Over the course of 6 days, more than 200 professional searchers and volunteers combed the rugged terrain around Russell Lake. They covered a search area that eventually expanded to 300 square miles, operating under the assumption that an injured or disoriented hiker could not have gone far in the steep, punishing country. The searchers utilized every tool available. Ground teams moved in tight grid formations through the meadows and the dense stands of krumholds, pushing through the thick brush of the drainages. Horseback units patrolled the equestrian trails, while searchers on all-terrain vehicles covered the dirt roads and wider paths at the wilderness boundary. From the air, the search was relentless. National Guard helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras swept the ridges and canyons, searching for a heat signature in the cold, high-altitude nights. The Civil Air Patrol flew search patterns over the high alpine plateau, looking for any sign of a bright tent, a piece of clothing, or the reflection of a camera lens. Yet, as the days turned into a week, the mountain yielded nothing. There was no scent for the tracking dogs to follow on the dry, volcanic soil. There was no thermal signature detected by the high-tech sensors overhead. Most baffling of all was the complete absence of physical evidence. When a day hiker disappears, they carry very little. But Ohm was a fully equipped backpacker. He had been carrying a large, bulky pack containing a tent, a sleeping bag, cooking gear, and extra clothing. Items that are designed to be highly visible and difficult to lose. If he had suffered a sudden medical emergency, such as a heart attack or a stroke related to his medication, his body and his heavy gear should have been found within a short distance of the trail. If he had fallen into one of the steep ravines or rocky crevices, the bright synthetic fabrics of his backpack or tent should have caught the eye of the searchers or the cameras of the helicopters. But there was only silence. The search was eventually suspended as the summer weather began to turn, but the mystery remained open. In the summer of 2013, when the heavy winter snows finally melted from the high basin once more, search teams returned to the Mount Jefferson wilderness. They brought cadaver dogs, trained to detect the scent of human remains even when buried under pine needles or light soil, and focused their efforts on the steep timbered slopes below the ridge where Ohm was last seen. They searched the boulder fields and the dense thickets, working with the knowledge that the wilderness is a dynamic place where winter snows can shift debris and expose what was once hidden. Again, they found nothing. The disappearance of Ronald Allen Ohm is a case that troubles outdoor professionals because of how little room it leaves for the usual explanations. In many wilderness disappearances, there is a clear narrative of error. A hiker who leaves the trail without a map, a storm that catches someone unprepared, or a steep cliff that suggests a fatal fall. But Ohm was an experienced woodsman who vanished on a clear summer afternoon, just a few hundred yards from his companions, in an area that is heavily trafficked and thoroughly mapped. He did not wander off into a trackless forest. He simply stepped off the edge of a well-traveled ridge to take a photograph and was never seen again. The Willamette National Forest is a place where the beauty of the landscape can make the wilderness feel approachable, almost gentle, to those who visit its popular trails. But the vanishing of Ron Ohm serves as a quiet reminder of the true nature of this country. It is a place where the distance between safety and complete permanent disappearance is not measured in miles, but in yards, and where the mountain can close over a man and a lifetime of gear as easily as water closes over a stone. A few hundred yards, a single photograph, and one of the biggest searches in Oregon history came home with nothing. Just north, in the Washington Cascades, an elite long-distance hiker would vanish one coffee and one storm from the end of a 2,000-mile walk. The Gifford Pinchot National Forest is a land defined by its giants. Stretching across the rugged spine of the Cascade Range in southern Washington, it encompasses over 1 million acres of some of the densest, wettest, and most complex coniferous timber on the North American continent. Here, the moist, warm air of the Pacific Ocean is forced upward by the volcanic peaks of Mount Adams, Mount St. Helens, and the southern shoulders of Mount Rainier, releasing its moisture in a near-constant deluge of rain and heavy, wet snow. Under this relentless watering, the forest grows with a prehistoric ferocity. Western hemlocks, Douglas firs, and massive red cedars stand shoulder to shoulder, their trunks thick as castle towers, their branches interlacing to shut out the sun. Below them, a secondary jungle of vine maple, devil's club, and thick carpets of moss covers the steep, broken volcanic soil. To step off the established trails in this country is to enter a vertical labyrinth where the ground is rarely flat. The visibility is frequently limited to the length of a fallen log, and the silence is absolute, muffled by a green shroud that absorbs the loudest scream. For those who walk the Pacific Crest Trail, this forest represents the beginning of the final act. By the time a northbound through hiker reaches White Pass, a high highway crossing that divides the Gifford Pinchot from the William O. Douglas Wilderness, they have already walked more than 2,200 miles from the Mexican border. They are no longer ordinary walkers. They are elite athletes of the wilderness, hardened by months of high-altitude passes in the Sierra Nevada, long waterless stretches in the Mojave, and the grueling climbs of Oregon. They know their gear down to the ounce. They know their bodies, their limits, and the subtle language of the weather. They have survived heat, thirst, blistered feet, and exhaustion. To these hikers, Canada is no longer a distant dream. It is a measurable distance, a matter of weeks and a few hundred miles of Washington's spectacular, rugged crest. Among them, in the autumn of 2016, was a 34-year-old man from Ohio named Christopher Fowler. On the trail, he was known simply as Sherpa, a name earned through his quiet strength, his steady pace, and his willingness to carry the heavy loads of a long-distance traveler. He was a tall, striking man with a thick beard and the lean, powerful build of someone who had spent the last several months doing nothing but walking uphill. By mid-October, he had reached the tiny mountain community of Packwood, just west of the pass, to rest, wash his gear, and prepare for the final push. The journey ahead was beautiful but notoriously difficult, crossing the high, exposed ridges of the Cascades where early winter storms are a constant looming threat. On the afternoon of October 12, 2016, Fowler was ready to return to the trail. A friendly driver gave him a lift from Packwood back up to the crest at White Pass, dropping him off near the highway junction around 3:30 in the afternoon. The air was cold, smelling of damp earth and the coming winter. Before setting out, Fowler stopped at the Cracker Barrel store, a small gas station and convenience store that serves as a vital oasis for hikers on the pass. He bought a warm cup of coffee, stepped outside into the gray afternoon, and walked north toward the trailhead. He was heading into the William O. Douglas Wilderness, a rugged landscape of high plateaus, ancient lava flows, and endless lakes, all buried beneath a heavy canopy of subalpine fir and mountain hemlock. His immediate destination was the next resupply point, but his ultimate goal was the Canadian border, just 366 miles to the north. That evening, Fowler's cell phone connected with a tower near the pass, sending a final routine ping into the digital network. It was the last sign of life ever recorded from his devices. After that, his phone went silent, and the forest closed over him. Had the autumn weather held, Fowler would likely have reached his next destination within a week. But the Pacific Northwest in October is a volatile place, and the wilderness was about to experience one of the most violent meteorological events in a generation. Within 48 hours of Fowler's departure from White Pass, the remnants of Typhoon Songda, a massive Pacific storm system, slammed directly into the Cascade Range. It was not a typical autumn rain. The storm brought historic winds, torrential freezing rain, and a massive dump of heavy, wet snow across the higher elevations of the trail. In the deep woods, the wind howled through the canopy, snapping mature trees like matchsticks and throwing down a chaotic tangle of fresh debris. On the ridges, temperatures plummeted, and the snow fell so fast and so thick that it instantly erased the trail, burying the familiar dirt tread under a deep, featureless white blanket. It was the kind of storm that transforms a familiar landscape into an alien, hostile world in a matter of hours, reducing visibility to a few feet and turning every drainage and ridge into a potential trap. Because through hikers frequently go off the grid for days at a time as they move between wilderness areas, it was some time before anyone realized that Fowler was missing. It was not until he failed to arrive at his next scheduled stop that the alarm was raised. When the search finally began, it faced almost insurmountable obstacles. The storm had left the high country buried under feet of fresh, heavy snow, what locals call cascade concrete, which was already beginning to freeze into a solid mass. The Yakima County Sheriff's Office mobilized a massive rescue effort, deploying ground teams, search dogs, four-wheel drive vehicles, and helicopters to search the Pacific Crest Trail corridor north of White Pass. They combed the areas around Bumping Lake, the high ridges of the William O. Douglas Wilderness, and the steep drainages that fall away from the trail. Yet, searching a dense coniferous forest under several feet of fresh snow is a slow, agonizing process. A person who has sought shelter under the low, thick branches of a mountain hemlock can be entirely invisible from the air, and even ground searchers walking just yards away can miss a white tent or a snow-covered pack. The dogs struggled with the cold, damp conditions, which quickly dispersed scents, and the constant threat of avalanches and falling timber made many areas too dangerous for volunteers to enter. As the weeks went by without a single clue, the search was further complicated by a series of reported sightings. The most significant came from a group of bear hunters who claimed to have seen a hiker matching Fowler's description near Blowout Mountain, a remote peak located roughly 62 miles north of White Pass, around October 22nd. If this sighting was accurate, it meant that Fowler had somehow survived the historic storm and had continued moving north through the blizzard, covering a remarkable distance under the most brutal conditions imaginable. The search efforts shifted northward, focusing on the rugged terrain around Blowout Mountain and the Snoqualmie Pass corridor. Teams of searchers, including specialized mountain rescue groups, spent thousands of hours scouring the dense timber and steep slopes of this northern sector. But the wilderness is vast, and the clues were non-existent. No dropped gear, no abandoned wrapper, no footprint in the mud beneath the snow was ever found. The sighting at Blowout Mountain was eventually questioned. In the confusion of a major storm, with many hikers scrambling to get off the trail, misidentifications are common. If Fowler had not made it past the initial high ridges near White Pass, then the searchers looking 60 miles to the north were combing the wrong forest entirely, while his true location remained buried somewhere in the dense, dark woods closer to his starting point. The official searches were eventually suspended as the winter snows set in, locking the Cascades in a deep, impenetrable freeze for the next 6 months. When the spring thaw finally came, volunteer groups and Fowler's family returned to the mountains, refusing to give up hope. His stepmother and father organized private search efforts, hiring professional trackers and utilizing drones to map the steep drainages and thick stands of timber that the official search had been unable to thoroughly examine. They searched the high-probability areas where a lost or hypothermic hiker might seek shelter, under rock overhangs, in deep tree wells, or along the banks of small creeks where water was available. They found nothing. The forest remained obstinately silent. Today, Christopher Fowler remains missing. His disappearance did not lead to a quick resolution, but it did leave a profound and lasting legacy. In the wake of the tragedy, his family's tireless efforts and their collaboration with the hiking community led to the creation of the Fowler O'Sullivan Foundation, an organization dedicated to helping the families of missing hikers by providing resources, search and rescue support, and public education. The foundation stands as a monument to a young man who loved the wild, ensuring that his name is remembered not just for how he was lost, but for how his loss helped others. Yet the mystery of his disappearance continues to hang over the Gifford Pinchot National Forest, like the thick fog that rolls off the Pacific. It is a quiet, heavy reminder of the thin margin between survival and tragedy in the high country. Fowler was not a novice who had wandered off a nature trail in flip-flops. He was a seasoned, resilient, long-distance walker who had successfully crossed some of the most demanding terrain in North America. He was healthy, strong, and highly motivated, with the end of his great journey almost within his grasp. And yet, when the weather turned and the forest closed its green canopy beneath a shroud of white, all of that experience and strength was not enough. The wilderness did not need to lure him into a trap. It simply changed the rules of the game while he was in the middle of it, turning a well-marked trail into an invisible line and the sheltering trees into a maze of shadow and snow. 366 miles from the end of everything, a storm closed over Kris Fowler, and the forest took him whole. From here, the countdown turns to its hardest ground, to the smallest of the lost, and the searches that could not save them. In a Colorado wilderness, a 3-year-old ran ahead on a trail and was gone before anyone could call his name. The Comanche Peak Wilderness stands as a rugged, high-altitude reach of Colorado's Roosevelt National Forest, a landscape defined by the relentless geology of the Front Range. It is a place of deep, V-shaped valleys and granite-streaked ridges where the air grows thin and cold as one gains elevation. At its heart lies the Poudre Canyon, carved by the swift and icy waters of the Cache la Poudre River. Here, the Big South Trail follows the river's path, winding through dense stands of lodgepole, pine, spruce, and willow that press tightly against the rushing water. In the early days of October, the aspens have usually turned to gold, and the forest floor is a quilt of dry needles and brittle fallen leaves. It is a beautiful place, but it is also a vertical one. The terrain is rarely flat. It is a constant, shifting incline of scree, hidden roots, and treacherous moss-slicked boulders. It is not the kind of country where a child can simply wander off and remain within sight of the path. On the morning of October 2nd, 1999, a group from a singles organization gathered at the trailhead for an excursion into this wilderness. Among them was 3-year-old Jaryd Atadero, who had come along with his father. Jaryd was, by all accounts, an energetic and bright child, accustomed to the outdoors and comfortable in the company of adults. The plan was a straightforward hike along the Big South Trail, a popular route that follows the river into the backcountry. As the group began to move, the pace naturally fractured. Some of the hikers were faster, pushing ahead to find a rhythm, while others lingered to take in the views or manage their gear. In the shifting dynamics of a group hike, Jaryd found himself moving with the faster contingent, his small frame darting ahead of his father. He was last seen at a point approximately 1.5 miles up the trail. He had passed 2 fishermen stationed along the riverbank, calling out to them with a cheerful, childlike confidence as he moved past. For a brief window, he was the lead element of the party, a small, bright point of motion in the vast, shadowed green of the valley. When the group regrouped shortly thereafter, the silence that followed was absolute. He was not just out of sight, he was gone. There were no shouts, no sound of a struggle, and no sign of a trail left behind in the duff. The forest had simply accepted him. The search that followed remains one of the most intense and heart-wrenching in the history of the Front Range. Within hours, the Larimer County Sheriff's Office had mobilized a massive grid search. Over the next 7 days, the scale of the effort was unprecedented. Professional search and rescue teams, specialized trackers, and hundreds of volunteers combed the dense timber, pushing through thickets of willow and climbing the steep, unforgiving slopes that flanked the river. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging swept the canopy, while dive teams braved the frigid, turbulent currents of the Poudre River, fearing the worst. The event drew a swarm of media, with television trucks lining the canyon roads, reflecting the national anxiety that had settled over the search. Despite the exhaustive coverage of the terrain, a search so thorough that it seemed impossible for a 3-year-old to remain undetected, the woods yielded nothing. No shoe, no scrap of clothing, no footprint in the soft mud. The search concluded without a single shred of evidence, leaving the family to confront a void that defied all logic. For 3.5 years, the mountain kept its secret. Then, in June 2003, a group of hikers wandering far off the beaten path stumbled upon a discovery that only deepened the mystery. High on a steep, nearly vertical slope, roughly 500 feet above the trail and several miles from where Jaryd was last seen, they found remnants of his clothing, his blue fleece jacket, his pants, and his small sneakers. Nearby, they recovered a skull fragment and a molar. DNA analysis confirmed the identity. It was Jaryd. The finding brought a grim and agonizing resolution, yet it provided no answers to the questions that had haunted the intervening years. The terrain where the items were found was extraordinarily difficult, a 45-degree incline of loose rock and jagged granite that would challenge even an experienced mountaineer, let alone a toddler. How a small boy could have reached such an inhospitable, elevated location, and why his belongings were scattered in the way they were, remains a subject of intense, unresolved debate. The death certificate issued at the time stated that the cause of death was likely a mountain lion attack, citing the nature of the recovery and the predatory environment of the high Rockies. However, this theory has been consistently contested by experts and investigators familiar with the case, who point to the lack of evidence of such an attack and the sheer improbability of the child's movement to that specific elevated site. Other theories, ranging from the tragic possibility of a wandering child succumbing to exposure to the more sinister suspicion of abduction have been raised, yet none have been proven. The case of Jaryd Atadero remains a stark reminder that the forest operates on its own terms, indifferent to the logic of search grids and the boundaries of human understanding. It forces us to confront the fact that a child can vanish in a matter of minutes, leaving behind a silence that lasts for years, only to be found in a place that makes no sense. The recovery of his remains did not solve the mystery. It merely defined the scale of the tragedy. How a small boy came to rest high on a slope no small boy could climb has never been answered, and perhaps never will be. There is only one thing harder to sit with than a child found in the wrong place, and that is a child never found at all. In Idaho, a 2-year-old vanished from the middle of his own family, leaving behind a silence that has never been broken. The Salmon-Challis National Forest is a vast, rugged expanse of high-altitude wilderness, defined by the jagged peaks of the Lemhi Range and the deep, timbered valleys that shelter the headwaters of the Salmon River in Idaho. It is country that demands a specific kind of respect, where the air thins quickly, and the landscape is defined by its sheer vertical scale. Tucked into this expanse, near the town of Leodore, lies the Timber Creek Campground. It is a small, quiet place, the kind of site that families choose when they want to escape the grid, nestled along the banks of a creek that feeds into a nearby reservoir. It is framed by heavy timber and dense undergrowth, a place where the mountain shadows stretch long and cold, even in the heat of a July afternoon. It was here, on July 10th, 2015, that a small family gathering unfolded in a way that would eventually command the attention of the entire nation and leave an open, aching wound in the history of the American West. Deor Kuntz Jr., a 2-year-old boy, had traveled to the campsite with his parents, his great-grandfather, and a family friend. It was meant to be a simple, last-minute trip, the sort of outing that serves as a brief reprieve from the pressures of work and the routines of home. The adults were there to fish and set up camp, and the toddler, wearing small cowboy boots, pajama pants, and a camouflage jacket, was ostensibly under their collective care. In the recounting of the afternoon, the details began to blur almost as soon as the realization dawned that he was gone. Some accounts suggested he had been playing near the campsite's edge, while others implied he had been left under the brief supervision of one of the adults, while the others turned their attention to fishing or unloading gear. Whatever the specific sequence of those minutes, the result was a vacuum. At roughly 2:28 p.m., a call was placed to 911. The boy, who had been there only moments before, had vanished into the trees. The response was immediate and, in its intensity, reflected the gravity of a missing child in a mountain forest. The Lemhi County Sheriff's Office, joined by the FBI and law enforcement agencies from across the state, initiated a search that would rapidly expand into one of the most exhaustive efforts in Idaho's history. Over the first 48 hours, the searchers threw everything they had at the terrain. They brought in K-9 units trained to track scent over rough, vertical ground. They employed ATVs to scour the perimeter. They used helicopters equipped with thermal imaging to sweep the canopy and the surrounding ridges, and they put divers into the cold, churning waters of the creek and the nearby reservoir. By the third day, more than 200 volunteers had joined the professional teams, forming lines to grid search the forest floor, turning over every log and checking the depths of every hollow. The geography of the area, while beautiful, is notoriously unforgiving. The Lemhi Range is a place of steep, rock-strewn slopes and thickets of pine and fir that can obscure a person within a few steps. Despite the thoroughness of the search, which included the use of sophisticated ground-penetrating radar and exhaustive interviews, no trace was ever found. There were no footprints in the mud near the creek. There was no sign of a struggle, no discarded clothing, no abandoned toy. In the months and years that followed, the site became a focal point for investigators. A former sheriff, personally haunted by the case, returned to the Timber Creek site an estimated 100+ times, walking the same perimeter, looking for the one sign that had been missed, the one piece of evidence that the forest might have finally chosen to relinquish. The mystery deepened as the investigation progressed, touching on the complex dynamics of the adults who were present that day. In the early stages of the case, the 4 adults were named persons of interest by law enforcement, a designation that brought intense public scrutiny and a cloud of suspicion that has never fully dissipated. Yet, in the decade that followed, no charges were ever filed, and no evidence was produced to substantiate any theory of criminal involvement. Every fragment recovered during the exhaustive searches, every scrap of cloth, every piece of bone or organic material was tested and retested by forensic laboratories, only to be identified as belonging to local wildlife or deemed inconclusive. The case remains officially open, a decade of silence punctuated only by the theories and counter-theories that thrive in the absence of hard, physical truth. The disappearance of Dior Kuntz Jr. unsettles not just because of the tragedy of a missing child, but because of the sheer, impossible scale of the silence that followed. He was 2 years old, wearing stiff, cumbersome boots that would have made travel through heavy brush difficult and slow. Yet he vanished within a radius that dozens of trained searchers, dogs and aircraft covered with obsessive detail. The forest did not just conceal him, it seemed to absorb him entirely, leaving behind no trail, no scent, and no wreckage. It serves as a grim reminder that the most sophisticated tracking methods in the world are often no match for the simple, absolute capacity of a deep forest to close over a person and hold its secret. The years have not made the silence any quieter. Every summer, when the light hits the trees in that specific dappled way, the questions remain, as fresh as they were in 2015. There is no closure, only a persistent, nagging awareness of how easily a human life can be erased by the landscape itself. A decade of searching, 100 returns to the same creek, and not one confirmed trace of a 2-year-old boy. The forest that takes a child and leaves nothing is the oldest fear there is, and the oldest and largest search of them all began with a boy sent back a few hundred yards through the trees to change his trousers. The Adirondack Park is a vast, folded landscape of northern hardwoods and dark, needle-damp spruce, a place where the mountains do not soar so much as they crouch, pressing down upon the valleys with an ancient, vegetative weight. In the heart of this region, near the town of Newcomb, lies the Santanoni Preserve. It is a place of Gilded Age ambition, centered on a great camp built in the late 19th century to mirror the rugged, untamable spirit of the wilderness. Today, the preserve is public land, a tract of protected forest characterized by long, winding carriage roads that lead from the outer world into the stillness of Newcomb Lake. The trees here grow in deep, chaotic stands, their roots matted into the peaty soil, and the canopy is often so thick that it creates a permanent twilight gloom. It is a quiet place, a place that feels as if it has been holding its breath for a very long time. On the 10th of July, 1971, 8-year-old Douglas Legg was visiting the preserve with his family. It was a summer morning, the kind where the humidity hangs heavy in the air, and the forest floor is alive with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. Douglas was a young, active boy, and he was walking along a carriage road with his uncle, moving through the woods toward the lodge. The distance was short, by any measure, a trivial stroll. They were perhaps a half-mile from the lodge, a distance that in open country would be covered in minutes. As they walked, the concern arose that the boy's legs were exposed to the thick patches of poison ivy lining the trail. It was a minor, everyday parental precaution. He was asked to turn back and return to the lodge to change into long trousers. It was a simple task, a routine change of clothes, a walk of a few hundred yards on a path that led directly to a known destination. He never arrived. The moment his absence was realized, the world of the Santanoni Preserve shifted from a place of recreation to the site of an impossible, unfolding void. The search that began that afternoon would eventually grow into the largest, most intensive manhunt the Adirondacks had ever witnessed. Over the course of 33 days, the machinery of a massive, coordinated effort descended upon those few acres of forest. Nearly 1,000 individuals participated in the sweep. New York Forest Rangers, state police, units of the United States Marines, and hundreds of volunteers who marched in lines, spaced only feet apart, through the undergrowth. They brought in bloodhounds, they deployed aircraft to monitor the canopy, and they utilized every method of human detection known to the era. In the desperation of those weeks, they even turned to the fringes of the search, allowing psychics and dowsers to walk the trails, hoping for a sign that the physical world was withholding. The searchers walked until their feet were blistered and their minds were frayed. They scoured the carriage roads, the dense spruce thickets, the marshy edges of Newcomb Lake, and the hidden ravines that cut through the preserve. They combed the ground with such precision that every square inch was accounted for, yet the forest yielded absolutely nothing. There was no torn fabric caught on a briar, no misplaced shoe, no footprint in the soft mud, and no stray item of gear. There was no evidence that a boy had walked that path, and no evidence that he had ever left it. The silence of the woods remained absolute. There was no indication of foul play, no trace of an abduction, and no sign of a struggle. The record is as hollow as the woods themselves. The boy simply ceased to be. The legacy of the disappearance of Douglas Legg is woven into the very structure of how New York State protects its wilderness today. The failure of that massive, exhaustive search exposed a critical lack of organization and protocol in the state's wilderness response. It was the catalyst for the professionalization of the New York State Forest Ranger search and rescue system, a direct result of the collective trauma of 1,000 people looking for a child who could not be found. The lessons learned in those 33 days of agony transformed the way search operations are managed in the Adirondacks. Yet those changes could not retroactively provide an answer for the family of the boy who vanished in 1971. Even now, decades later, the name remains a shadow in the official records, a case that stands as a testament to the fact that, in the right conditions, the forest can swallow a human being so completely that not even 1,000 searchers can find a single atom of him. This is the unsettling truth that the Santanoni Preserve holds for all who study it. The more people you bring to search, the more you realize that the forest is not a passive environment. It is an active, enclosing force. The fact that an 8-year-old child could evaporate from a half-mile of defined trail while being the focus of the largest search operation in regional history defies the logic of the search and rescue profession. It suggests that there is a threshold in the woods, a point where the physical reality of a person simply detaches from the world of the living and vanishes into the green. 1,000 searchers, a month, half a mile of forest, and not one trace of a boy. If the woods can do that with everyone watching, then there is no limit to what they can do with no one watching at all. Which brings us to the strangest disappearance in the history of the American forest. 5 men, 1 working car, and 20 miles of frozen timber no one can explain. The Plumas National Forest occupies a sprawling mountainous territory in northern California, where the Sierra Nevada mountains bleed into the southern Cascades. It is a landscape of immense verticality, dominated by high ridges, deep-cut canyons, and forests of ponderosa pine and white fir that can turn impenetrable in the winter months. In late February of 1978, The upper elevations of the Plumas were locked in a deep, unforgiving freeze. The snowpack was heavy, the nights were long, and the logging roads that crisscrossed the high country were largely inaccessible, buried under layers of ice and packed, frozen drifts. It was into this cold, silent expanse that 5 men from the Yuba City area, Gary Dale Mathias, Jack Madruga, Bill Sterling, Jack Hewitt, and Ted Wyer, drove on the night of February 24th, and from which, for the most part, they never returned. These 5 men were friends, all living with varying degrees of intellectual disability or psychiatric conditions, and they had spent their Friday evening attending a college basketball game in Chico, about 50 miles from their homes. They were seen leaving the game in high spirits, piled into Jack Madruga's 1969 Mercury Montego. They had every intention of returning home that night. Yet, they never arrived. By the following Monday, when the car was found, the geography of their disappearance became a riddle that has defied explanation for nearly half a century. The Montego was discovered abandoned on a remote, unpaved road deep within the Plumas National Forest, at a location called Rogers Cow Camp. This was not a wrong turn taken in the dark. It was a journey of nearly 70 miles in the wrong direction, away from Yuba City and toward the highest, most desolate reaches of the forest. The car itself was a point of immediate, chilling confusion. It was found in excellent condition, with no signs of mechanical failure, no accident damage, and plenty of gasoline remaining in the tank. The doors were unlocked, and there was no evidence of a struggle or any indication that the men had been forced to stop. They had simply exited the vehicle, left their warm coats inside, and stepped out into a sub-freezing night, walking away from the road and into the trackless, snow-covered timber. Why they did this, why 5 men would abandon a perfectly functional car in the middle of a mountain winter, 70 miles from their homes, is a question that has been asked by law enforcement, family members, and investigators for decades. There is no record of their thoughts, no note left behind, and no evidence of what compelled them to leave the safety of the vehicle to face the elements in the dark. The search that followed was one of the most exhaustive in California's history. Hundreds of volunteers, professional search and rescue teams, and law enforcement officers combed the mountainsides. They utilized snowmobiles, horses, and aircraft, but the forest was effectively impassable, its canopy creating a ceiling that hid the ground from above, and its terrain creating a gauntlet for those on foot. The official search was eventually suspended as the winter deepened, leaving only the families to wait through the spring thaw. The truth did not emerge until June, when the melting snow began to reveal what the forest had kept. The discoveries were scattered across miles of rugged, unforgiving terrain. The first remains were found by a group of motorcyclists near a Forest Service trailer located 19 miles from where the Montego had been abandoned. Inside the trailer, rescuers found the body of Ted Wyer. The interior of the trailer was a site of profound, quiet tragedy. Despite the fact that there was a supply of food stored in the cupboards and a propane tank available for heat, the trailer had not been used to its full potential. Wyer had apparently survived for weeks after the others, having lost a significant amount of weight, before finally succumbing to the cold and exhaustion. His shoes were gone, and it was discovered that he had been wearing the shoes of one of his companions. The rest of the party was found in a widening arc across the forest. Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling were located roughly 11 miles from the abandoned car, their remains eventually uncovered as the snow receded. Jack Hewitt was found 2 miles beyond the trailer, his remains scattered by the elements and local wildlife, a grim testament to the time that had passed. But among the 5, one name remained absent from the ledger of the recovered. Gary Dale Mathias, just 25 years old, was never found. His shoes were discovered inside the trailer where Wyer had died, suggesting that Mathias had somehow removed his own footwear and, in a state of terminal confusion or delirium, walked out into the deep, snow-covered forest in his socks. Despite an intensive search of the surrounding drainage, and the miles of forest beyond the trailer, no trace of him was ever discovered. The disappearance of the Yuba County Five remains the most complete and haunting vanishing in the American wilderness record. It defies the simple categorization of a hiking accident or a momentary lapse in judgment. It is a case of collective displacement, a departure from reality that led 5 men into the dark, frozen heart of the Plumas. Every theory proposed over the years, from a sudden, unexplained panic to a misunderstanding of the geography, has failed to account for the totality of the event. The forest did not just take their lives. It took their intent, their reasoning, and their final moments, leaving behind only the cold, hard facts of a car left on a road and a trail of scattered remains that leads, ultimately, to nowhere. This is the end of the ledger. We have traversed 13 forests, from the crowded ridges of the south to the high, shadowed peaks of the Sierras, and in every case, the result is the same. There is no singular villain, no supernatural force, and no grand hidden conspiracy. There is only the forest itself, the dense, indifferent green that covers the earth. It is a place that does not need a reason to keep what it finds. It does not need to be malicious to be absolute. It simply waits, and when a person steps off the trail, the canopy closes, the sound fades into the needles, and the world moves on. We are left with the silence of the trees, the emptiness of the search, and the understanding that for all our technology and all our vigilance, the wilderness remains a place where a person can be, and then, in the blink of an eye, simply ceases to be. The ledger is never closed, and the woods, ever patient, continue to hold their secrets.